Hi everyone, I'm Nathalie Goodkin, a curator in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the American Museum of Natural History. We're going to show you how we can use corals to study climate. These amazing animals change the chemistry of their skeletons when the ocean changes, generating a record of our planet. But before we get too far, I'm happy to introduce you to Ross Ong, a PhD student at Columbia University and AMNH.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. Glad you could join us this afternoon. I'm Ross, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia University and at the American Museum of Natural History. And I'm working with Natalie to study corals and understand how the climate has changed back in time. Corals are these beautiful creatures that are able to live for several hundreds of years, making them excellent recorders of past ocean and climate conditions. And understanding how these climate systems have changed in the past could give us a better insight into predicting future climate change. So now I'm sure we are all excited to talk about corals, the ocean, and the Earth's climate. But before we get to your questions, let's first watch a short video to learn about how corals record climate. And if you have any questions while you're watching, please feel free to type it in the chat or post them in the comments below, and we can answer some of them after we watch the short video.
You can look out at a calm ocean and it looks like nothing's happening. But in reality, there are so many forces that are happening within that water. It's going to change at night, it's going to change depending on where you are on the planet. You have ice that's melting and forming. The pH will change as you change how much CO2 gets absorbed. So really there's nothing in the ocean that's static. And that makes it even harder to study because any point in time is only really reflective of that point in time. We've only been recording the environment in detail for the last maybe 20 years with some ship data from the past, 120 years. We can go ahead and measure for hundreds of years in the future, but the imperative to understand how our climate system works is really now. And so we need to understand the system back through history. I think it would surprise people to know that there are natural instruments that we have in the ocean collecting this data for us. Corals grow in these large formations and they're building skeleton as they grow. As they secrete their skeletons, they will take in chemicals from the seawater based on the conditions they're growing in. And so we can go back and look at specific chemicals that tell us information about temperature, pH, salinity, and reconstruct those environmental conditions over the past several hundred years. A living coral would go back 500 years, but we can also look at fossil corals that can go back through the last 10,000 years. At this point, humans are having a very large impact on the environment, a larger impact than we can understand what will happen as a result. Little changes can make such a large difference in how the ocean moves and circulates and what that means for the life that's in it. The only way that we can really improve our ability to make good management decisions is to understand how the system worked before we were impacting it. Protecting corals is important for so many reasons. It's really, really important for biodiversity. They provide significant coastal protection in storms. And from my perspective, it would take us enormous numbers of years and financial dollars to instrument the Earth as well as the reefs are. Being able to preserve these samples provides us with an enormous resource for understanding our climate system, both in the future and back in time.
Right, so one of you asked how we got interested in this subject, and my path to this subject was kind of long, but it started actually with a real interest in fish, and then realizing that fish depended on the chemistry of the water to know where they wanted to live. And it was at that point in a class in college that I learned that corals recorded the chemistry of the climate and recorded what was happening in the water. And I became very interested in this and started to pursue it for my career. Ross, how did you get interested in this topic?
For me, I got interested in marine sciences. I'm relatively fairly new, you could say. I just started actually scuba diving a few years back when I was doing my research assistant stint back in Singapore when we were looking at corals in the region. And ever since then, I've decided to just pursue this and turn this into a career, I could say.
Scuba diving is an important thing to think about because it's a wonderful way to see the reefs. But when we scuba dive, we need to be really responsible about how we treat the reefs. As trained scientific divers, you could see in that video, we operate on the reef different than tourists do. But when you're with a group of tourists, you want to make sure that no one's touching the corals, that everyone's staying as far back as possible. You want to limit how much sunscreen you use because that can come off your skin and get into the water around the corals as well. Ross, do you want to talk to them about how old all the corals we're sampling are?
Yeah, so you asked about how old these corals are. So basically for our research, we look at really huge, giant boulder corals that could be about 300 to 400 years old. We look for these huge corals because we want to try to reconstruct temperatures from the corals back in time that are beyond what the instrumental records that we have currently. So the bigger the coral, the better, you could say.
It's also another, and someone else just asked about the types of corals. So you can see in the picture behind me, that's a Copophilia natans coral, which is a coral found in the Caribbean. And they grow really, really slowly, maybe only 4 to 5 millimeters per year. So that's a coral we really like to sample because the sample behind me here is estimated to be about 400 to 500 years old. So we get a really long record. Which type of coral we sample changes depending what ocean we're in because we have different species growing in different oceans. So you won't find a Copophilia as commonly in the Pacific, but you do find a coral called Porites, which we don't usually find in the Atlantic. So you have to think about what ocean you're in and what corals will be available to you. We have another question coming in. What part of the world is being affected most by climate change, and can you describe the conditions of the water? So regions that are being affected most by climate change right now are really tropical regions or regions where currents are coming from tropical regions because those waters are getting warmer, and they're actually getting warmer slower than many other regions, but it's going to the threshold where corals can't survive as healthily in those windows. And so if you look sort of along the Great Barrier Reef, where you've got a current coming from the equator down over the Great Barrier Reef and into what we call the Coral Triangle and the Indo-Pacific, those reefs, along with the Caribbean, are having some of the greatest impact from climate change right now. The water gets affected because it gets warmer. Sometimes the amount of hydrogen in it changes or the pH changes. And also land use changes can impact the water quality in terms of how clear it is. Ross, do you think we're ready to shift to one of our favorite sites?
I think we should.
All right, so the picture behind us that I was talking about earlier is actually a coral from Tobago. And this is where Ross and I were about almost a year ago now, collecting corals for a research project we just started there. So as you watch this video, please keep all your questions coming and we'll come back to answer more. But first, let's have a look at the reefs of Tobago.
I'm an oceanographer and I study the history of the ocean's role in climate. Climate systems don't just impact one location. Climate systems impact a large area. We have buoys that we can put in the ocean that can record environmental conditions, but we can't cover the entire ocean with buoys. Corals serve as a natural buoy where they are recording all of those conditions using the chemistry of their skeleton right where they're growing over several centuries. So I've been working in the Pacific Ocean for a very long time, but ever since I completed my PhD thesis, which was looking at the North Atlantic Oscillation in Bermuda, I've wanted to return to the Atlantic. The North Atlantic Oscillation is a measure of the difference between sea level pressure at 2 points in the North Atlantic. And what it's telling you effectively is what the wind patterns are. When those pressure differences are similar, the winds slow down, they slacken. When those pressure differences are larger, the winds speed up. As you change these winds and their directions, you change the storm tracks, you change the wave height. It also changes surface temperature, both on land and in the water. In the modern record, the NAO has the strongest impact here in Tobago. And so we're trying to get coral cores to understand how the system is changing both through time and geographically. The first thing you really need when you want to go work in a foreign country is a collaborator who wants to work with you and is interested in the science questions you're asking.
And because I work on coral reefs, good old Google, found me and asked if we were interested in collaborating. By trade, I'm really a coral reef biologist. I am very much interested in environmental health and disease, how they are influenced by changes that are going on. Throughout my time, I've seen going from pretty resilient, healthy reefs to really disastrous densities and diversity.
We decided we would involve Dr. Conrad Hewen at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and then 2 students that would start at roughly the same time. One in the US really working on the climate questions, and one here in Trinidad working on human impacts on reefs.
We had chosen Speyside as our primary site, which is where we're at now, and you can actually see in the background 2 of the infamous islands, which is Goat Island and Little Tobago. Both of these islands are known for their large corals, which is what you really want to be able to get these long-term climate records.
At any given location, what we're doing is we're drilling a coral core. We're getting up each morning, we have an enormous amount of equipment, we're loading it onto boats and heading out to sea. We're identifying those corals and then we're going ahead and sampling them. Our main goal for this trip was to collect a core from the largest coral we found last spring when we were here surveying. This was a very difficult core to drill. We estimated that the coral was about 3 meters in height. It was in about 45 feet depth, which is very deep for drilling.
I've been diving this site since the 90s. It is known for their strong currents, where their surface currents go in one direction and under the water the currents go in a different direction.
When we showed up in the morning, we expected to be there 3, maybe 4 days. We showed up, there were no currents at the surface, there were no currents at the bottom, the visibility was crystal clear, and we were able to get to the bottom of that core in 1 day.
It is a very short-term injury. It's not lethal to them. When we cover the hole with an inert substance, the coral eventually grows over it.
We were able to collect a core that was 2.8 meters long, so that could be up to 500 years of environmental record. So once we get the samples back to the lab, the first thing that we do is that we slice them into rectangular pieces.
When we cut the corals, we would be able to see these growth rings, very similar to what you would see in tree growth rings.
And from there, we'll start with our chemical analysis. Strontium is one element we're very interested in. If it gets colder, the corals incorporate more strontium into their skeleton, and when it gets warmer, they incorporate less strontium. And with records of sea surface temperature from the last 20 years, we're able to calibrate each coral to have a thermometer back in time. One of the concerns of the next 50 to 100 years is that as our climate system changes, the NAO will change. This will impact shipping routes, it will impact energy supply through hydroelectric dams and wind farms. This will impact droughts and water supply for large populations. And so the first thing we really need to do is to understand how this system has operated in the past and what might happen as we change the system around it.
As a Caribbean person, we're all about trying to move towards sustainable development. We're starting to see a shift in some of those earlier species that had disappeared. They're actually starting to come back, which is very exciting. I'm very optimistic that if we could continue to do land management in time, that we'll be able to preserve our reefs and let them come back to something that they were like in the 80s and 90s.
The cores hold so much information. We can study ocean currents, we can study ocean physical conditions, we can study the biological conditions on the reef, we can study the nutrients that the corals and the other plankton are living off of, all recorded within the coral skeleton. It would take us decades to extract all the information from them. It looks that there'll be years to come of work here in Tobago to better understand the corals and the climate of this region.
I want to answer one question first, which was, when we drill the corals, does it hurt them? And the answer is, it's a short-term injury, as my colleague, Dr. Guppy said. When you look at these big globular corals, the only part that's living is the very surface. Everything down below is just dead remaining skeleton. So we put a little bit of a hole in the top surface. But then when we fill that hole up with cement, the coral covers back over that hole, usually within a matter of 2 to 3 years, depending on how quickly it's growing, and the coral recovers fully. We do closely monitor this, so we know every 2 to 3 months we check on the coral afterwards, so we know that the coral is continuing to live happily where it is. And we also have a lot of really funny stories where we call up one of our colleagues and say, I want to go back to that island in the middle of the Pacific you went to. Can you tell me where the coral is? And they'll say, well, find the palm tree, swim to the right, turn left at the big sea fan and swim another 100 feet and you can drill there. And when we do those types of things, we often run into the drill hole that they did 30 years ago. So we know that the coral is able to live happily for decades after we sampled. And we're very, very careful when we do this to make sure that we don't damage the coral permanently while we're sampling. Ross, Young Choi Kim asked a question about melting ice. Are you able to answer that one?
So that's actually a great question. Yon Choi Kim is asking, is it true that melting ice can affect the oceans? Well, actually it does, because what melting ice does is it adds fresh water to the ocean. So that changes the chemistry and changes the salinity of the ocean, which in turn affects how currents flow, and it affects ocean circulation. And that in turn affects how heat is transported around the world. And that could have actually direct and indirect effects and impacts to different climate systems around the world. I think we have another question about how long ago did the coral reefs first appear on Earth?
Yeah, so Michael's asking about how long ago did coral reefs first appear? And it's an interesting story to look at the evolution of corals. We think they first appeared about 500 million years ago. So they've been living on the planet for a really long time. And one of the things that we hypothesize happens with corals when there is rapidly changing climate is that sometimes we will only find corals that have no skeletons, or what we call soft corals. So the ocean conditions become unfavorable to making skeletons. They don't die off, they continue to live. They just change to a dominant species that doesn't have skeleton formation. And then when the oceans change back, we start to see an increase in the number of hard corals or skeleton-based corals going forward. So corals are one of the more robust species on the planet in terms of how they've changed, how they've survived Earth's changes in the past. And there's a number of researchers at the museum looking specifically at the evolution of corals as well. So Ginger's asking some question on behalf of some 3- and 4-year-olds, and those children are asking, why is the coral the color that it is? And this is one of my favorite topics because corals provide such amazing color to our planet, and particularly to the sites on a reef. But the coral actually has no color at all. So the corals are white. But the corals have symbionts that live on top of them. And symbiont's a very big word if you're 4. But it basically means that there's other animals living on the surface of the coral, and those animals help out the coral, and the coral provides those animals with a home. And so they have this happy relationship together, and it's the symbionts that provide the coral. I'm sorry, symbionts that provide the color. And symbionts come in all range of colors. There are pink corals and purple corals and the most amazing bright blue coral I've ever seen. There's also a lot of yellows and browns and greens. And so when you look at a coral and you see a lot of different colors, it's the little microscopic animals living within the top surface of the skeleton that are providing it with that color. Ross, there's a great question about Sahara sand, which actually has just been coming to the Atlantic in very large amounts recently. Did you want to talk about how that might impact corals on the reef?
Well, yeah, as Nathalie said, the corals have these tiny algae plants that live in the tissue layer of the corals. So the amount of Sahara sand that comes over through the Atlantic actually provides, it's a good source of iron and nutrients that are beneficial for the algae, and they're able to grow more if they have more of these nutrients. The issue is if there's too much of this in the water, because corals actually need clear nutrient for water to grow so that they can have enough sunlight that could reach these tiny plant cells. But if there's like too much suspended material in the water, that could also have detrimental effects on the corals. It's a good, I guess there has to be a balance of both. And there's another great question in relation to that. Ruchi asked, Kiran Rao asked, how do corals survive and how does coral eat plankton to survive? So they survive having this mutualistic relationship with the zooxanthellae or the algae. The polyps of the coral also have these tiny stingers where they are able to use that to get the plankton and put them inside their little tiny sort of mouths, and they could feed off of these plankton and get nutrients and energy from them. Yeah, so I think we have another question. Nathalie, you want to?
Sure. Ruchi is asking what it's like to be underwater with all those coral reefs and fish. And the honest answer, Ruchi, is it sort of depends on what the weather is like outside. So if you've got a nice, clear, calm day, it's really amazing to be under the water and see everything. It's very rare, even with as much diving and snorkeling as I do, that I don't see something I've never seen before when I'm underwater. And the noise of the reef actually sort of serves to block out your brain from thinking about too many other things, and it can be really majestic. However, on a rough day, it can be really quite unpleasant, even at the very bottom of the reef, because those waves can be reaching down all the way to the bottom of the water. And what a lot of people don't know about oceanographers is that for the most part, people who become oceanographers get terribly seasick. So even when you're underwater scuba diving, you can still be getting seasick if you're in these really big, 5 to 6 feet swells. So a lot of what it's like depends on the day. The next question we have here is from Roxanne, which is, what would the loss of coral and coral reefs mean for mankind and future generations? The loss of reefs would be very devastating to us on many levels. Coral reefs are the nurseries of the ocean. And so all of the, or most of the fish go to coral reefs to hatch their babies. And this is where small fish have refuge to grow. So the sort of demise of coral reefs would be very poor for fish hatcheries and for the biodiversity of the ocean. They also provide our coasts with a lot of protection. So the storms that bring in really strong waves, they tend to break over the reef and calm down before they reach the coast where we're living. And so that's another way that coral reefs are incredibly important to our own society. I think it's with all of our best interests to do everything we can to try to preserve the reefs. And I received a question from Hillary, age 9, asking how she can help to preserve the reefs. And I would say, from what I've seen in the past few years, one really important thing is to make sure to properly throw away your garbage. The amount of plastics accumulating on reefs, just from my own observation, is growing enormously in the past few years. So trying to make sure that we keep our garbage out of the ocean is one thing that children can do to really help with the reefs. So Allison Wolin is asking, is the NAO related to the Gulf Stream? Ross, did you want to handle that one?
Yeah, sure. So the NAO is actually, I think from the video we've seen briefly, it's about the pressure changes that happening between 2 points in the North Atlantic Ocean. And the changes in these pressure systems actually also impact how the water in the North Atlantic circulates and how the water flows. So that might have some impacts on how the Gulf Stream flows over time. And this could impact many different countries, such as the US and Europe as well. So there you go.
There was a question earlier about the ice melting, and that actually can have a really big impact on the Gulf Stream as well. So if you have increased melting of ice in the North Atlantic, such as we're seeing in Greenland, this can put a bunch of fresh water into that area where normally the water is incredibly salty and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, which helps fuel the speed of the Gulf Stream. So the more ice we melt, the more likely we are to slow down, still small changes, but slow down the Gulf Stream. And I think we have one final question, which is, how quickly can we analyze the coral and make, turn that into understanding our global wind systems? In terms of rapid knowledge, measuring the wind systems directly is a quicker way to know what's happening with the wind over, the next 5 to 6 months. The work that we do is incredibly detailed. It will take us, so we collected those corals from Tobago last October, and it is probably 5 to 6 years before we're finished working with them. There will be results in between, but it's a long process. That data that we generate looks at the last 300 to 400 years and how systems are interacting, which gets put into the information gets incorporated into the global models, which work into predictions. And so every time you're looking at a climate-based question, you're looking at longer-term questions. Whereas if you shift to a weather type question, such as, what's happening with the winds this summer, that would need to be looking more at instrumentation measurements of what's happening today. So I think we're close to out of time. I want to thank you all on behalf of myself and Ross for joining us today and for all these really great questions. We hope you enjoyed it. I know that we very much enjoyed being with you today. The museum is doing these broadcasts every Friday at 1 p.m. On the AM&H YouTube channel. Next Friday, a colleague of mine from astrophysics will be taking you on a virtual field trip to see comets up close. So we hope you'll sign back in and join us for a trip to the comics next Friday. Thank you all very much.